So it's safe to assume, based on the comments I got on my original retelling of this first story, that there are some very mixed opinions on this legend. Some fully believe it to be true, others do not. But what is the truth behind it all? The Philadelphia Experiment. A popular World War II urban legend, first emerging in the 1950s, adapted into a movie in the 1980s, and last year I even wrote and narrated my own retelling of the story, and it's like my fourth most popular video as of right now. And for good reason. It's fascinating. The story is fascinating, it intrigues people, and the potential to create a good story around it is just an untapped well of creativity. A story of a ship being turned invisible, of possibly teleporting, possibly time traveling even, of causing all manner of horrifying effects on the crew of the ship. But what is the truth behind the legend? Did the Philadelphia experiment really occur in some way and get covered up? Or was it all a hoax? Or does it come from some true events that really did occur, but have had a game of telephone played with them that changed them into the story we know today? Today, that's the question we're going to dive into. We are going to examine the original story and the individual who came forward with it in 1955, and afterward, three other obscure stories and urban legends from World War II, examining each mystery and trying to find the truth behind them all. Let's dive in and get started with the Philadelphia Experiment, starting with the backstory. The original story brought forward in 1955 detailed an experiment conducted on the destroyer escort class vessel USS Eldridge on October 28, 1943. In 1955, the original story surfaced when one Carl M. Allen, who claimed to have witnessed the event, sent an account of the event written down by hand. He claimed the U.S. Navy attempted to turn a ship invisible. The story went like this. Some researchers developed a new take on the unified field theory, a term coined by Albert Einstein. These researchers apparently thought that using a large electrical machine would enable them to bend light around a desired object. Okay, cool. So, this would result in the object the light is bending around due to refraction being made invisible. The Navy saw the potential of this research and they allowed the experiment to be conducted and even sponsored its development. The idea being to turn ships invisible and possibly even make them invisible to radar. War is over in that case. Different versions of the story include different details, but this is a rough summary of the original version as well as I can piece it together. As it goes, the USS Eldridge was outfitted with the technology and machinery needed to make her invisible, and the big old red button was pushed. More than once. Supposedly, testing began in the summer of 1943 and continued until October of that year. The experimenting was done at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Now, these early tests resulted in the Eldridge being made invisible to a certain extent. It never quite got to the point that everyone wanted it to be in, though. Then, during the test on October 28, 1943, a greenish fog took over the spot that the Eldridge had been in as the machinery was activated. Several people observing the experiment reported that they felt very nauseous afterward as well. And then the ship disappeared. And now here's the scary, gory part everyone loves. When the ship reappeared, things had gone horribly wrong. The crew apparently suffered all manner of ghastly side effects from the experiment, or specifically this test. Some were driven insane by various mental disorders caused by the experiment, and those were the ones who perhaps got off lightly. Others were fused into the hull and bulkheads of the ship, frozen in place, turned inside out, simply disappeared, and depending on which version of the story you check out, some other side effects get included. One sailor of particular note is the one who, after the test, ended up one deck below where he started with his hand embedded into the metal hull of the ship. Other sailors also went, quote, completely bananas, end quote. Here's a description of the scene. Many of the crew on deck were laughing like maniacs. Others were rocking in place on the floor with their eyes open wider than anyone should have been able to. Very clearly somewhere far away mentally. And others had even been fused into the metal hull and superstructure of the ship. A drooling, slack-jawed face with a bulged tongue and half-rolled back eyes was staring at the two sailors from out of the metal wall it had been fused into. And the horror didn't end there. More bodies were fused into the railing, deck, and superstructure. One sailor was even hanging below the bridge wing, his body limp and swaying in the wind, and his body fused into the steel from the neck up, looking like he'd hung himself. On one wall, a limp arm was sticking out, bent at a near perfect 90-degree angle. One window up on the ship's bridge was coated in a telling splatter of red mist. That's from my version of the story. That's how I described it, and I think it was pretty spot on with the original details. Some other versions of this story, I don't think this was in the original from what I've read. The details kind of get different. Again, it's like a game of telephone as different retellings happen. Add that when the Eldridge disappeared, she then randomly reappeared in a completely different area. She reportedly teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. Apparently, the crew of the SS Andrew Furuseth had a perfect view to observe the ship when she reappeared and a front row seat to all the crazy manner of horror that was unfolding aboard her. Some versions say she traveled back or forwards in time, and I know that was the approach the 1980s movie took. Some retellings add in different details that those who survived the test were later brainwashed into believing none of it happened in order to keep it all a secret. Alright, to further understand the motive behind such an experiment, let's take a look at what was going on around the world at the time it supposedly occurred. I think there was a little thing happening at that time, some minor know-nothing event called World War II. Yeah, just a little minor trivial thing. World War II was raging at this time. And at this time in 1943, the United States was battling Imperial Japan in the Pacific Ocean. And while the tide had been turned since the Battle of Midway, with the Japanese being more or less on the defensive for the rest of the war, save for a few offensive attempts, the United States, to them, anything to get that war over with as quickly as possible was on the table. So, we have a motive for why this experiment would have been considered. Obviously, the atomic bomb was the outcome of anything being on the table, but taking the Philadelphia experiment story as is, the ability to turn a ship invisible, or even a fleet of ships invisible, would be huge. Game-changing. War-ending, even. The motive for such an experiment like this to be conducted is very clear. Like I said in my version just a few minutes ago, if you have the ability to turn your ships invisible, war's over. Right there. War's over. Everyone, you did great. Pack up. Go home. So, we have a motive that could reasonably lead the Navy to do such an experiment. We have a person claiming they saw it having come forward, and we have the ghastly details. So what is the truth? Now we come to it. The individual who came forward in 1955 with this story. Can Carl M. Allen be seen as a trusted source, or did he make the whole thing up? Let's talk about him. Carl M. Allen, full name Carl Meredith Allen, was born in 1925, and he was an American merchant marine. He was known as a, quote, master leg puller. He pulled pranks and did what he could to get out of work. He was discharged from the U.S. Marine Corps less than a year after joining in 1942, and it was in 1955 he claimed that as a merchant marine, he witnessed the invisibility experiment on the USS Eldridge, that he met Einstein, and was personally tutored in physics by him. That's a bold claim. Let's see if it pays off. Yeah, he did, Spino. He really did. Also, with all of that in mind, I'm just going to flat out say it. Allen Lee openly said later in life that he made the story up. Then he changed his mind, and then he went back to saying he made it up. Real reliable sounding guy. When he came forward with his story of the experiment, he referred a journalist to a specific article that would back him up. That article also seems to have never existed, and Allen later said he made the story up to scare the hell out of the journalist in question. Master leg puller to the very end, because this was 12 years after he first came out with the story. Also, if he had actually seen this happen, his story would have stayed the same. It didn't, though. It changed. It changed every time he was asked to recount it. That would not have happened if he had actually seen a specific event occur. He was playing a game of telephone with his own story. All in all, Allen does not sound like a reliable source. So despite Carl M. Allen not sounding like a reliable narrator, did this happen? Did this story actually happen? People go both ways, but historical experts agree that the story is an urban legend. Now, as I say that, some people are definitely taking up arms and writing hate comments. Cool. Internet's great. but that doesn't change the fact that the experiment likely never occurred, and there's a few reasons I think this beyond Carl M. Allen not being a super reliable sounding source, such as people who live in Philadelphia that have commented on my other video. They've said that the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard is not a place that you can do something like this and it not be noticed. They have said that it's too open, and since I've not been there, I'm going to take the word of people who live there until proven otherwise. Even beyond that, though, timeline inconsistencies with the USS Eldridge herself are all over this story. She was commissioned in August 1943, and she was in New York until September. Then in October, at the time the experiment happened, she was down in the Bahamas for her shakedown cruise. That would be super hard to fake. There's just too many people involved for someone not to talk. That's the issue with really big, grand-scale conspiracy theories, is that you have to sometimes have hundreds of people keep a secret. You know how hard it is to have 10 people keep a secret? A big group of people cannot keep a secret forever. Now, I'll throw proponents of the story a bone here. What if the logs were simply faked? Okay, that's valid. So is the argument that the experiment was actually done on a different ship. Again, valid points. Well, the Eldridge herself, we know, wasn't in Philadelphia due to her action report. In the remarks section that cover 1943, she is mentioned as being elsewhere. And in 1999, a reunion of the crew of the ship was held, and they all said they had never docked in Philadelphia. Another explanation some have put forth is that there was no experiment, but something was installed on a ship, specifically a different ship. A system that would generate an electromagnetic field, which would degauss the ship in question, which is essentially to remove magnetism from it, from what I understand. So, okay, valid. Something like that's put on a different ship. That could be seen as a source for the story. This system was on Royal Navy ships, but they had no effect on visibility or radar. These machines and what they could do, however, might have been enhanced by local talk and evolved into the story. Then maybe Carl M. Allen got wind of it and made up a little bit more of a narrative for it. The story of the destroyer USS Timmerman might also have had an influence that created the Philadelphia experiment legend, because a high-frequency generator was placed on her, though her crew never suffered side effects from it. Now, before all of you get your torches and pitchforks out because I said I personally don't think it happened, let's have a civil conversation over it, shall we? And let's play devil's advocate for a moment. If something like this really happened, would it be covered up? Oh, absolutely, 100%, no questions asked. But did the Philadelphia experiment itself, as this story presents it, actually happen? I'm going to go with no. And not just because Carl M. Allen, the individual who came forward with the story, is an unreliable narrator, and also because other people who have come forward saying, oh, I was on the Eldridge, they can't give any proof of that. It's just, trust me, bro. Even with all of that unreliable narrators in mind, or people who claim they were there but they can't prove it, the fact that Carl M. Allen's story doesn't stay consistent is very telling, and why different people who have said they've been on the Eldridge come forward and their stories are always just a little bit different. It's just very telling, and why I have a much easier time believing something like the Orang Medan happened over this one. That at least is, based in reality and not theoretical physics. Orang Medan, nerve agent. The Philadelphia experiment, theoretical physics, spinning light around a ship, possibly even teleporting it or causing time travel in the more extreme versions before mutilating the crew in a slew of ways. Yeah. Awesome story, but not true. That's my verdict. Awesome story, love it, but not a true story. But that's okay. That is okay. So before you get your pitchforks out again, I'm gonna, that's fine. Believe what you want. That's my verdict, though. It's not true. So that's going to wrap up this section. Now let's move on to the next urban legend. One that I absolutely can see being true and might just actually believe in myself. It is the final weeks of World War II in Europe. Nazi Germany is losing on all fronts. Throughout the war, they have been plundering art and gold from all over Europe, and now they are undertaking a desperate bid to hide it all away forever so the Allies will never find it. They load many priceless works of art, gold, artifacts, and other objects onto a train somewhere in southern Poland. It has many scheduled stops, but then, inexplicably, it does not arrive at one of the last ones. It has simply vanished. And that is where the mystery comes in. The one that has never been solved. Where did they hide the gold train? And more crucially, did the gold train even exist? Searches for this supposed lost train go all the way back to the Cold War when the Polish army began looking for it. There was reason to believe a train of missing gold and art might exist. In 1944, American troops found a train in Austria loaded with box after box after box of gold, silver, china, art, luxurious rugs even. More missing art and gold turned up in the homes of Nazi officials too. Yeah, me too, Spino. I'm shocked as well. Stunned even that they would turn up in such places. Perhaps one of the most famous still missing works of art from World War II is the Amber Room, which was completely taken apart and taken by the Nazis, and then it just also disappears without a trace. I've seen some people even suggest that it found its way onto the gold train, along with almost everything else that is still missing. And now we come to it, the legend of the gold train, and the question on if it was real, where did they hide it, and where is it now? So starting off, something often connected to the gold train legends is something known as Project Reese. This was something that the true motive behind remains somewhat unclear, but it was a construction project built into the Owl Mountains, consisting of shelters, bunkers, tunnels in the mountain, and it was built by forced labor from prisoners in concentration camps. Ideas behind the project include it being underground command centers where Nazi forces would be safe from any bombings, or could dig in and withstand a siege, or that it was used for weapons development and secret projects. There never has been any sign of a train loaded with more than 300 tons. 300 tons. I'm half tempted to leave that in the video. I think that's kind of funny. There never has been any sign of a train loaded with more than 300 tons of gold and art having been in those tunnels, though. 2015 saw a sudden spike in attention directed toward the train when it was thought to have been found. An object 100 meters long was discovered buried under the ground with ground-penetrating radar, which apparently showed a man-made object housed within a man-made tunnel 50 meters underground. However, this turned out to merely be a natural formation, and all the excavations toward the object stopped, but now the world was interested. This obscure story had gone mainstream. In 2015 as well, a former Nazi soldier, supposedly on his deathbed, confessed the train did exist, but he didn't say where it was. I don't know personally if that confession is actually verified to have happened, so take that with a grain of salt. If anyone knows for sure, please tell me in a comment. The 65th kilometer was sectioned off by the Polish officials, so only authorized teams could search the area. The area was also cleared by the government to ensure no traps or unexploded mines remained behind from the war, and the area was cleared as deep as 1 meter. The area around where the underground object was discovered saw a 44% increase in tourism. Despite the town making gold, as the mayor put it, no actual train was found, though the team searching for it did discover large, priceless paintings from the 16th century that had been hidden behind a wall. So they did discover some lost treasure. Deputy Culture Minister of Poland stated, "I am 99% certain that the train exists. Definitely an armored train like those from the war. That's what it looks like." Despite more searches in 2016, 17, and 18, nothing was found, and no trace of the train ever existing was either. Ideas for what happened to the train, if it exists, include it being buried in a secret Nazi bunker, which is valid because those are still being found even today, or that it entered an abandoned coal mine and was then buried there. If you've listened to my story based on this legend, you'll know that's the idea I went with, simply because if it was buried in one in an area with literally hundreds, how could we ever find it? So I find the idea of it entering and being buried in an abandoned coal tunnel to be a very likely one. A train being loaded with all the stolen loot taken by a crumbling empire at the tail end of a war, hidden away never to be found, is a thrilling story. But is it true? Did the gold train exist or not? I don't know. I don't have an answer. Historians, most anyway, don't think it did. But I could absolutely see something like this existing in some way. Maybe multiple trains were hidden and it wasn't one big one, or maybe it sprung up from stories of art being moved around on plunder trains, and maybe it never happened. But then, where is all the still missing art, gold, and secrets? So if it existed, what happened to the gold train? If it existed, maybe it was buried somewhere in an unmapped railroad, maybe, hidden in some bunker we don't know about, or maybe it was destroyed. We also know that the Nazis did seal off entrances to certain sections of tunnel systems and bunkers with explosives, sometimes ones housing stolen art and other treasure. We've found ones like that. So maybe the train isn't a place we have already found, but is hidden behind a collapsed wall, or maybe the exact tunnel has never been found at all. Either way, though, if the train exists and its treasures exist, which they most certainly do, we just don't know where they are, we have never found any direct traces of it. We don't know, and we might never truly know. I know most historians think the train never existed, and I'm not an expert in the field, so I defer to them, but this is still, out of all the legends that came out of World War II, the one that I could absolutely see being true. And I could see, a train being hidden away and forgotten. So my official position on this one is, I don't know. Unlike the Philadelphia experiment, I don't think I can really make a reasonable guess here. I can see the arguments for and against about the same. But a train being hidden away is way more likely than a ship traveling to another dimension and no one in the city seeing a thing. Maybe one day we'll know for sure, but until then, my official opinion is, I can see this absolutely existing, but I don't know for sure, so I defer to the historians. And with that in mind, let's move on to something a little more out there again. Die Glocke, Nazi Germany's time machine. I like this one. However, this one is also a huge rabbit hole. Easily could have had its own video, because what Die Glocke isn't always the same. It gets tied into the Nazi UFO theories and the gold train and secret bases in Antarctica and time travel and theoretical physics. And I'm just going to keep it more summarized with the main points that stay more or less consistent. If you want a dedicated video on Die Glocke and every legend it connects to, tell me in a comment. I don't have time to do it in this one and cover everything in the detail it would deserve. So we're going to hit the main points that are more or less consistent in every different theory or retelling. Now, if you've been around my channel for a moment, you'll know that, like with the Philadelphia experiment and Nazi gold train, I wrote and narrated a story based on this legend too. In my story, I kept it as a time machine because I wanted to write a story specifically about Nazis getting killed by dinosaurs when they tried to use it, because they deserve to just meet the most horrific end you can imagine. So, in my story Die Glocke, it was a time machine, and I actually changed some of the details about it. I made it smaller, and according to the actual legend, Die Glocke was actually a large device, some 12 feet high and 9 feet in diameter. Die Glocke, or the bell as its name translates to, has been described as a top-secret scientific device, or Wunderwaffe, as a glowing, rotating contraption, supposedly a time machine or anti-gravity weapon, associated with free energy suppression research. Like I said, this one is a whole rabbit hole. The legend, or rather conspiracy theory, comes from the early 2000s when Polish author Igor Witkowski first described the object, which later got mainstream attention by journalist Nick Cook. Die Glocke apparently was powered by something called Cerium 525, a highly radioactive, purplish, metallic-looking liquid, apparently some kind of irradiated form of mercury. Cook added that scientists and technicians who worked on the bell who did not die from its effects were wiped out by the SS close to the end of the war, and the device was moved to an unknown location, which is sometimes when the gold train comes into it. Supposedly, Jacob Sporrenberg was the one who ordered this execution of around 60 people. That was something I did work into my story, but the motive of mine was different, with a Nazi colonel killing them just so he could steal it. Speaking of German military officials, supposedly SS commander Hans Kellmer traded Die Glocke to the Allies for his freedom. Hans was an engineer who was responsible for engineering projects and other secret V weapons programs, such as the V2 rocket, among others. We don't know if he died or went into hiding or escaped, what. But his technically official, in the eyes of the Allies anyway, date of death was eventually written down as May 9th, 1945. Some theories say that this was just to look good on the books because he gave them something, so they gave him his freedom, and he was just dead to the world, new identity, all that stuff. But simply put, Hans's real fate is not known. As far as real history goes, he simply disappears near the end of the war, and multiple theories exist about his fate, but nothing is known for sure. However, his official date of death is, again, May 9th, 1945, but if he actually died then, we don't know. Maybe he died, maybe he escaped, we just don't know. Honestly, Nazis who has disappeared or otherwise escaped justice at the end of World War II could be a whole video in and of itself. If that's something else you want to see, let me know. So, though, how does all this connect to Die Glocke, and where does it all come from? Well, it all goes back to Igor. In 2003, he claimed to have discovered evidence of the device while reading recently declassified documents written by the Polish government. From there, he says he did additional research and even had more documents given to him by an unnamed Polish government official. According to the timeline, Die Glocke was apparently conceived in 1942, developed for the next 2 years, and began experimentation about 2.5 years after first being conceived in 1944. These experiments exposed prisoners in concentration camps to high radiation and resulted in their deaths, and the weapon was indeed capable of distorting time. As I said, some theories say the Die Glocke was buried on the gold train, and others say various German rocket scientists and aerospace engineers hired by NASA and other agencies in the US government knew about Die Glocke as well. So what do we have here? We have an extremely powerful weapon the Nazis supposedly built, and no one knows where it is. That's how it always works, isn't it? This, on its own, I can actually believe the idea that the Nazis had secret advanced weapons that got hidden away and have just never been found. That, as a concept, I can believe. But let's play devil's advocate again and assume that Glocke existed and it was an anti-gravity weapon or time machine or whatever you want. Do you really think that if Nazi Germany had, we'll say, a time machine, that they would not have tried to use it if they really had something like that? Like, when it became clear they were going to lose the war, do you really think that they wouldn't have tried? I sure don't buy that if the Nazis had such a weapon at the time, then at the most desperate minute of the 11th hour of the war, they wouldn't have just attempted to use it just as a Hail Mary. Was Nazi Germany well ahead of most of the world with its scientists and advanced weapons? Yes, in some ways. And that has helped spawn believers for the Die Glocke conspiracy theory and other things like the Nazi UFO theories and secret bases in Antarctica, which connect to the Hollow Earth. Yes, that is actually a conspiracy theory as well. Like I said, whole rabbit hole. Would need a whole video dedicated to it just to cover it in all the details. So back to Die Glocke itself. Author Jason Colvatio, I hope I said that name right, is an American scholar who studies fringe theories about history and ancient aliens and the validity of these things. His study on Die Glocke came to this conclusion: that Die Glocke was merely an idea recycled from earlier ideas popular in the 1960s. And fellow author Brian Dunning, who studies skepticism and science, wrote that a lack of historical records of any kind about it make it increasingly unlikely that anything like it actually existed. He added, "All we have in the way of evidence is a third-hand anecdotal account of something that's desperately implausible, backed up by neither evidence nor even a corroborating account." And UFO skeptic Robert Schaefer criticized Cook's claims directly as a classic example of how to spin an exciting yarn based on almost nothing. He visits places where it is rumored that secret UFO and anti-gravity research is going on, and writes about what he feels and imagines, although he discovers nothing more tangible than unsubstantiated rumors. He added that the Glocke is only supported typically by those who wish to prove other conspiracy theories to be true to further their own agendas, and not people who honestly are truth seekers. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and since there is absolutely none here other than someone saying, I saw this or I read this in a top secret document, then I'm just gonna place this wonder weapon in the category of merely being a good story or a good premise for a story, but not reality. I think this one is really cool. This one is probably my favorite of all the ones that I've talked about in this video, just because the crazy insanity that really comes with it if you go down the whole rabbit hole. But I have to say, though, the Glocke is in the same camp as the Philadelphia experiment. I don't think it actually existed. But let's move on to something else that also most definitely did exist, and to the extent we still are not 100% sure on. And something that possibly was still active as late as 2005. So like with all of these stories that I've covered, I use them as basis for plots in my urban legend short stories. And Axis power holdouts that refuse to surrender after the war also fall into that camp. And while this is something that actually happened, we have to ask ourselves, what is the truth behind these holdouts? Because there are some urban legends associated with them, or unconfirmed stories. How many were out there, and when did the last one surrender? Well, unlike my story, which I was definitely a bit loose with historical facts, all of Nazi Germany's holdouts surrendered in 1945. If we look at a timeline of the Axis powers surrendering, we'll start with Nazi Germany in 1945, and let's get some backstory on real history real quick first. Take out your notebooks, class is in session, this will be on the test. Nazi Germany officially surrendered on May 8th, 1945. Got that? With some final groups participating in open combat surrendering a few days later, but still in early May. Fascinating and completely off topic, on May 5th, before Nazi Germany officially surrendered, the United States and German soldiers fought on the same side against the SS at the Battle of Kassel Itter. That is completely off topic, but I just wanted to share it anyway. I think it's cool. That'll be a bonus question on the test. So anyway, VE Day is May 8th. Some of the German forces who didn't surrender immediately included the crew of German submarine U-977, who surrendered in August, but most famously, the last garrison of German soldiers who surrendered was the garrison at Bear Island. So the garrison on Bear Island is somewhat, as I said, famous for being the last forces to surrender in the war when it comes to Germany. They were part of Operation Broadsword, which is a German operation during the war to establish a meteorological station in the, forgive me for this pronunciation, Svalbard Archipelago. Yeah, I totally said that wrong, and there's going to be more people with pitchforks pounding at my door next. Internet's great. Due to a communication blackout, they were just unaware at the time that the war ended, and they finally surrendered only after they got communications reestablished in August. In September, a Norwegian vessel picked them up and they surrendered to the ship's captain, and thus the last troops of Nazi Germany had surrendered. Imagine if they hadn't got that radio working and like years later someone found them. That would have been something. Any holdouts of the war in Europe were gone by the time they surrendered, and the war was truly over there anyway, with these last forces of Nazi Germany surrendering. Note that I said over there, because in the Pacific, things were not quite as neat and tidy. Japan was another story. Some of its holdouts lasted much longer than 1945, and I think this is absolutely fascinating. Some Japanese holdouts simply didn't know Japan surrendered due to communication blackout, others simply didn't believe the surrender was legit, and others just felt bound by their ideologies to continue to carry on. Many verified Japanese holdouts were found within 10 years or so, One noticeable example was the incident in November 1955 when seaman Noboru Kinshotia, again, I hope I said his name right, I couldn't find how to pronounce it, was found in the Philippines. And he shortly afterward killed himself so he wouldn't, quote, return to Japan in defeat, end quote. Another example was Sergeant Soichi Yokoi, who was found on Guam in 1972, 28 years after the United States took control of the island in 1944. He had been there the entire time. The last confirmed Axis powers holdout was another Japanese one that surrendered in December 1971. Again, I just find that fascinating. There are some, if you look online, you can find them really easily. There are just lists of Japanese holdouts who just didn't surrender for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. Some of them are just crazy. But those are the verified ones. Now, let's talk about some of the urban legends around Axis power holdouts who refused to surrender and did not do so for literal decades, and in some cases, if they ever did at all. According to some unconfirmed urban legends, some Japanese holdouts lasted into the 1980s, and possibly one as late as 2005, but that last one that surrendered in the 70s was the last confirmed one either way. Now let's talk about them, and remember to take notes. So what is the truth here? Is there any truth to these long-term holdouts after 1974 is what I'm just going to call a long-term holdout. Anything after 74. It is known that the last Japanese forces surrendered did so in the 70s, 30 years after the war. Throughout the decades after World War II, deep in the jungles of Asia or on islands in the Pacific, holdouts from Imperial Japan were discovered until that last one in 1974. There were unconfirmed reports of an active holdout being found in the 1980s as well, but no evidence that any of those who had been there were alive still was found. Did any last as late as 2005? We don't know. It was reported some holdouts were still active, and searches were done for them, but like so many of these urban legends we've covered today, nothing was found. So if there was still a holdout active as late as 2005, they were never found. So, to put it simply, we don't know. When did the last true Axis power holdout either die or surrender after World War II? We don't know. Well, on that somewhat depressing note, I hope you enjoyed this look into these various obscure stories and urban legends. Any one of these could have a deeper dive done about them, as you could probably tell. So if you'd like to see any of those at all, let me know, and there's a lot with each of these, so I could absolutely do a whole video on some of them. I was originally planning to give each one its own video, but I didn't want to spend a whole month on this specific topic. I thought, how about we do a quicker video that's all of them, and then if there's anything that people want to see a specific video on, I can do that at a later date. So yes, consider this a teaser if you'd like a deep dive into any of these, and tell me which one. Now, if you did enjoy those, please go listen to my original stories based on each of these and tell me what you think of them. I'd love comments and feedback. So with that said, I do hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and have a good one, everyone. It feels good to be back after being gone for 2 weeks. It really does, and I have a lot of fun topics coming up down the pipeline, including more paleontology videos, more videos on obscure, weird things that happened in history, and your all yours favorite maritime disaster. So stick around because the next couple months I have some fun topics lined up. So with that said, one more time, thank you for watching, and it is great to be back.